Fidel Castro and 500,000 Cubans took part in the African wars which ended colonialism. This little-known story began in the 1960s when Che Guevara fought in the Congo. His mission failed, but Cuba continued helping African revolutions. Amilcar Cabral's rebellion in Guinea-Bissau dealt a serious blow to the last colonial 1974, the Carnation Revolution in Portugal brought down the dictatorship. Guinea-Bissau was the first colony to be granted independence, and Mozambique quickly followed. Angola was the empire's gem, from where most of the colonial wealth had come. Ending colonial rule there was not going to be simple. Agostinho Neto of the MPLA had since the early 60s firmly allied his movement with the Eastern Bloc. Like Lumumba and Amilcar, his struggle against colonialism had quickly won Cuban military support.
La Unión Soviética tenía relaciones con el MPLA y por los contactos con la dirección del MPLA veíamos que era un movimiento progresista y independentista de verdad. El pensamiento de Neto era socialista. Ahora, Neto era un hombre independiente. Nosotros somos socialistas también y no nos gusta que nadie nos diga lo que tenemos que hacer. Y Neto era como nosotros en ese caso. Y que era partidario del socialismo en Angola. Pero del socialismo dirigido por los angolanos. Ni por los chinos, ni por los soviéticos, ni por los cubanos siquiera. Y todos nosotros somos socialistas y no nos gusta que nos dirijan ni los soviéticos, ni los chinos, ni nadie. Nos dirigimos nosotros mismos. Nosotros somos del criterio de que cada país debe ser dirigido por la gente del país.
The Angolan liberation struggle had been more complex from the start. Other than Neto's MPLA, Angola had two other rival anti-colonial movements. Holden Roberto's FNLA was based in the north of the country and received arms and training from the US, mainly via Mobutu in Zaire. Jonas Savimbi's UNITA was based in the south, and they too got American support, which was mainly channeled through apartheid South Africa.
Pour nous, c'était le camp occidental, n'est-ce pas, qui avait les mêmes idées que nous. Et de l'autre côté, il y avait le MPLA, qui était carrément dans le camp marxiste-léniniste. Le communisme était l'opposé du christianisme. Eh bien, c'était clair, parce que si nous étions profondément chrétiens, je suis chrétien, et la majorité de FNLA étaient des chrétiens, et les militants, on ne veut pas être d'accord avec le communisme.
The world was divided, west and east. Those who were supported by URSS, they were not welcomed by Americans. Therefore, vice versa. But the Angolan, to get weapons, to get diplomatic support, to get political support, they must join to one side. This brought a division among the Angolans. We were passing all the time accusing each other and losing time keeping our fighting internal, not to fight against colonialism.
Independence was within reach if only the three movements could agree to sit around the same table and decide the destiny of their country. After months of mediation efforts, the three delegations flew to the Portuguese town of Alvor to negotiate terms of independence.
To go to Alvor, everyone was afraid. What the Portuguese will do? Maybe we'll arrest somebody, we'll kill somebody. And when we arrive there, the leader, they don't want to eat, to touch anything to eat. They say, no, you are the young boys, you are the first to eat. When I will see one of the boys dying, I know that he's poisoned. Distrust was toward the Portuguese, and distrust also among ourselves.
We went all of us to Penina Hotel. The first problem that occurred in Penina was the way the Portuguese put us.
The ground floor was a place for the conference. The first floor was UNITA. The second floor was FNLA. The third floor was MPLA. The last floor was the Portuguese. We didn't like this structure. People just thinking that there is a plotting. We think that during the night, maybe MPLA was negotiating with the Portuguese government. So many news were circulating, rumors. Hey, my friend, you are sleeping. That they are negotiating. You know, this is a very bad atmosphere.
The FNLA and UNITA feared that their local opponent, the MPLA, would be favored by the new leftist Portuguese regime. But it soon became obvious that the Marxist captains simply wanted to end the bloody chapter of colonial wars. For a week, they sat around the negotiating table, hammering out Angola's transition to independence.
We said, first of all, when are we going to be independent? And the date of November 11th was proposed by Pushionet. He said that 11th of November was the armistice day, and we should be independent on that day.
Let's be frank. The Tree Liberation Movement participated for the struggle for independence. There is unanimity. But who will be the first president? There was not agreement.
The Alvor Agreement vaguely outlined the transition, but the shaky deal did not provide a solid basis to overcome the years of mutual hatred. It needed no more than a spark to revive the fighting.
The three leaders wanted to be heads of state before elections. They did not want to wait for November 11th. Each one brought its own army.
On a commencé à apprendre que les FNLA étaient en train d'introduire des armes. Parce qu'ils voulaient, avant la proclamation de l'indépendance, prendre une position. Alors, la décision qu'on a prise, c'est expulser les gens du FLNA et de l'UNITA de Luanda.
Each faction tried to gain control of the capital. Whoever held Luanda on the night of November 11th would be officially recognized by the outside world as the legitimate government of Angola. As the fighting intensified, the superpowers stepped in to fan the flames. This was no longer a civil war in the far corner of Africa. The crisis quickly turned into a full-blown superpower confrontation, where Angola was no more than the battlefield.
This struggle in Africa broke out after Vietnam. The United States was highly sensitive at the time to the fact that it had been driven from the field in Vietnam and that our opponents, namely Moscow, would take advantage of this period of American weakness or the perception of American weakness to secure geopolitical gains elsewhere. If the MPLA achieved power with its strong connections to the Cubans and to the Russians, you would see the first serious physical penetration of the East Bloc into African affairs. And we regarded that as a strategic threat. We provided arms and financing to hire mercenaries, provide trainers, provide weaponry to Roberto's armed elements, and through Mobutu, that equipment and funding was put before the FNLA.
Les Aérois ont commencé à envoyer quelques unités pour les aider, n'est-ce pas, pour les encadrer. Et après, l'aide a augmenté. Et chacun devait aider ses alliés. C'est tout à fait normal. Les Soviétiques l'ont fait pour le MPLA, n'est-ce pas? Les Américains l'ont fait pour le FNLA et l'UNITA. Une opération américaine montée par le gouvernement américain, officiellement. Il n'y avait aucun secret.
Not only the Americans were keen to contain the possible Soviet influence in the region. To the south of Angola, apartheid South Africa was eyeing developments with concern.
Communism, as far as South Africa was concerned, was a real threat. A threat in the sense of dictating, taking over the whole of the country. And we couldn't have that situation here in South Africa. that they could come through and instigate and plant the ideology of Marxism here in southern Africa. And that meant we're the next target, we're the cherry on the cake.
The South African Defense Force decided to move into Angola. There, they immediately found natural allies in the local movements that had been chased out of Luanda by Neto's leftist MPLA.
I one who received the generals from South Africa. And I remember the commander of the troops tell me clear, who are you? I say, I am George Valentin, representative of UNITA. I don't know. You are not MPLA. No, I am UNITA. I'm sure, I'm afraid. I don't know. I didn't receive orders to find UNITA here. We came to defend FNLA and to fight against the communists and so on, to arrive in Rwanda to put FNLA in power. But it is UNITA. They stopped to phone to Pretoria to ask what we can do with the troops of UNITA here.
À l'époque, l'Afrique du Sud représentait l'apartheid, mais nos cadres étaient différents et la guerre avait dépassé nos niveaux. Le conflit s'est internationalisé. Et entre deux mots, vous choisissez le moindre. Pour nous, à l'époque, c'était le moindre mal. Évidemment, c'était l'apartheid. Eh bien, on avait besoin de l'aide. Malgré nous, on acceptait ça. Ça, c'est la vérité.
That phase was the phase of guns and the money. You don't have guns and money, you don't have power. You can have dreams. You don't have, if you have no guns, you have no money, no politics.
The scheduled date for independence was approaching fast. With US logistical support, the FNLA troops, accompanied by soldiers from Mobutu's regular army, advanced from the north. UNITA soldiers, along with the South African army, moved up from the south. The MPLA, despite receiving consignments of Soviet weapons, suddenly found itself at a disadvantage.
Y Angola lo que necesitaba era combatientes y armas allí, en ese momento. Cuando están los surafricanos avanzando, no se puede esperar el 11 de noviembre. Si esperamos el 11 de noviembre, llegan los surafricanos y llega Mobutu a Luanda y no hay independencia. Y se envió un mensaje al gobierno soviético, pero en realidad ellos no estaban dispuestos a hacer nada dentro de Angola hasta el 11 de noviembre. Nosotros sí estuvimos dispuestos.
Temos aproveitado imenso da experiência da Revolução Cubana. Sentido, por outro lado, uma solidariedade extraordinária do povo, entusiasmo que não podemos medir.
Quando nós decidimos pedir a Cuba uma ajuda, fizemos um pedido formal. Pois é, a mensagem chega de Fidel é muito maior. Então ultrapassa-nos. O nosso pedido é ultrapassado. Eu disse, vocês vão ser esmagados. Não é só isso que vocês precisam.
Cuando se produce el 23 de octubre la invasión de Angola por tropas regulares de África del Sur, no podíamos cruzarnos de brazos. Y cuando el MPLA solicitó nuestra ayuda, le ofrecimos la ayuda necesaria para impedir que el apartheid se instalara en Angola.
Nós tínhamos pedido, sei lá, pacote de rebuçados. Eu disse, não, pacote de rebuçados não, vocês precisam de 80 sacos de açúcar, tantos litros de água, preciso uma misturadora, preciso... Eu trouxe um plano muito mais completo. E como não tem ainda cozinheiros, eu tenho cozinheiros aqui, eu posso mandar.
This was not to be another covert operation like those Cuba had conducted in Africa throughout the 1960s. Fidel had decided to engage overtly in Angola. Cuba's elite special forces were dispatched along with 35,000 foot soldiers to help Neto's men. Operation Carlota guaranteed that Cuba would play a major role on the Angolan battlefield.
Переброска кубинских войск в Африку застала нас совершенно врасплох. Мы ничего об этом не знали. Пришла телеграмма от посла нашего в Гвинее, что садятся самолеты с кубинскими, войсками на борту, солдатами. Нас схватили за голову. Просто было недовольство. Недовольство, что вот кубинцы действуют не посоветовавшись y действуют неосторожно.
Nosotros no consultamos esa decisión. Si nosotros estamos haciendo movilización y enviando grandes cantidades de hombres para Angola, eso no se puede hacer en secreto. Se puede mandar 10 personas en secreto, se puede mandar 36.000 hombres en secreto. Es decir, es una operación abierta.
Но я знаю некоторых членов руководства, которые, так сказать, наполовину возмущались. Ну как же они без спроса, понимаете, идут там авантюру. Ну вот, но пришлось примириться. Что делать? Никаких санкций мы не предпринимали в отношении Кубы. Они имели уже советское оружие. Уже имели. И мы, повторяю, если бы вот серьезно, значит, возражать против этого, нам надо было с кубинцами поссориться. Куба была предпольем к Соединенным Штатам. У нас там были военные сооружения, важные для нас. Как стратегический пункт Куба была очень важна.
We were worried about Cuban involvement because at that stage the talks about limitation of strategic weapons were taking place. There was talk about Brezhnev's visit to United States, which never take place, by the way, after this episode.
My assumptions then were that the involvement of the Cubans was Russian-driven. It took me years later to reach a different conclusion, that the Cubans played to bring the Russians in support. That news reached Washington in the summer of '75, and I remember it was greeted with considerable concern. This is the first time foreign military forces had been introduced onto the continent of Africa since the colonial period back at the turn of the century. First time. We felt at that point that it was necessary to face this Cuban issue head on, square on.
Cuba is a red flag in the United States because anything that Cuba does, we hate. So when they sent troops to Angola, we had no choice but to say this is the end of détente, even though the Soviets really were not responsible. To see Cubans operating anywhere outside of Cuba was something that we considered a defeat for the United States.
¿Y por qué están irritados? Porque lo tenían todo planeado para apoderarse de Angola antes del 11 de noviembre. Angola es un territorio rico en recursos naturales. Cabinda tiene grandes recursos petroleros. Algunos imperialistas se preguntan ¿por qué ayudamos a los angoleños? ¿Qué intereses tenemos nosotros allí? Ellos están acostumbrados a pensar que cuando un país hace algo es porque está buscando petróleo, o cobre, o diamante, o algún recurso natural. No. Nosotros no buscamos ningún interés material y los imperialistas es lógico que no lo entiendan. Porque se guían por criterios exclusivamente chauvinistas, nacionalistas, egoístas. Estamos cumpliendo un elemental deber internacionalista cuando ayudamos al pueblo de Angola.
All the pieces were in place for a final showdown. It was only a week to November 11th, and all the warring parties were converging on Luanda. It seemed that the new nation would be strangled at birth. The final clash took place at Kifongondo, only 30 miles from the capital.
Mais la bataille de Kifongondo était une bataille décisive. Ben, on voulait à tout prix arriver à Luanda. Et c'est la vérité pour empêcher que le MPLA proclame de façon unilatérale l'indépendance.
Queriam fazer uma sanduíche, né? Foi difícil, foi. É que muitas vezes não dormimos a pensar como é que íamos defender. Foi quando então a unidade assim, cubana, uma companhia que chegou aqui, foi no dia anterior à Batalha de Kifongondo. Chegou uma companhia de cubanos, isso lembro meu bem. Foi uma coisa de surpresa, né? Não foi dizer que a gente sabia que iam chegar. Só ficamos satisfeitos quando soubemos que na retaguarda estava uma companhia de cubanos.
Isto desde que os cubanos conseguiram desembarcar em Cabo Verde o material de guerra que foi transportado a altas horas da noite, ou quase já de madrugada, via os tais órgãos de Stalin, os lança-foguetes de 40 canos. Quando os cubanos começam com os morteiros e os órgãos de Stalin a fazer uma preparação de fogo incrível.
La première fois quand ils ont utilisé les fusées là, les órgãos de Staline, c'était formidable, c'était pas manipulé par les Angolais. Quand ils nous ont bombardé avec ça, nos hommes qui n'étaient pas habitués, c'était la grande panique.
The MPLA won the decisive battle at Kifongondo, and on the night of November 11th, 1975, 400 years of Portuguese colonialism ended. Agostinho Neto was recognized as Angola's first president.
Fidel tinha mandado uma caixa, aquilo era tudo tabaco coíba. E o Neto não fumava. E o presidente Neto manda pedir fósforos. E alguém trouxe fósforo. E ele acendeu um tabaco. É a primeira vez na vida que eu vi o presidente Neto dar uma baforada. Quando toda a gente começou assim, a estranhar-se, a dizer, olha, ele repara que estão todos a olhar para ele e diz assim, foi Fidel que me deu.
The fighting did not stop with the Declaration of Independence. The United States did not recognize Neto's presidency and was more adamant than ever to dislodge his Soviet-backed government. But the American Congress feared that they would get entangled in another Vietnam, so they decided to prohibit all U.S. clandestine support to Angola. Once the U.S. supplies dried up, the MPLA managed to contain its local rivals. The South African Army also withdrew from Angola, but it continued to arm and train Jonas Savimbi's UNITA rebels. Agostinho Neto had won the first round of the battle for independence, so he invited revolutions, but none of his ventures had been as successful as this. African leaders competed to express their personal gratitude. For 3 weeks, Fidel toured the continent where he was treated as a hero of African independence. Cuba's internationalist policy had finally borne fruit. In the late 1970s, Angola no longer made international headlines. But Agostinho Neto had not yet managed to end the civil war. Jonas Savimbi's forces continued the guerrilla attacks from the south of the country. So Neto requested that a Cuban contingent remain in Angola to help the National Army. In 1979, Neto died before seeing his country attain true and stable independence. It was his disciple, the young Marxist ideologue of the MPLA, José Eduardo dos Santos, who would now have to confront the coming battles. Less than a year after Neto's death, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. His vision of the Cold War was to alter the course of events in southern Africa.
Reagan felt, as a strong Cold Warrior, that we wanted to do everything possible to counter the Soviet Union. And there was this feeling that we want to do to them what they did to us. And it wasn't just Africa, it was the entire world. And he saw Angola was a perfect place because there were Soviet advisors, Cuban troops, a government that was very pro-Soviet. So he says, how can we counter the Soviets there, make life difficult for them the way they made life difficult for us in Vietnam?
The broad message was that America is back. We were going to engage in a more, shall we say, a more robust diplomacy in which the use of power in all its elements, not just military, but diplomatic, strategic, economic, was going to be used.
Reagan wanted the Cubans out of Angola, and U.S. policy in southern Africa had to concentrate on achieving this objective. The American plan was to propose to the African leaders something they desperately wanted, and in return, link that offer to the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola.
I guess I was inspired more than anything else with a conversation I had with Julius Nyerere, the then president of Tanzania. He said, Mr. Crocker, the Southern African process must begin in Namibia. That's where you must focus your efforts. That's where you must start your efforts. Namibia is the key. He didn't really want to hear a lot about Cubans in Angola. He recognized ultimately that we were serious about that agenda, but he said begin in Namibia.
Since 1975, South African troops had conducted the war in Angola from Namibian territory. But when South Africa pulled out of Angola, its troops remained in Namibia. SWAPO, Namibia's liberation movement, regarded the apartheid government as colonizers and demanded their immediate withdrawal. Their case won support in 1978 at the UN when Resolution 435 unanimously demanded that South Africa evacuate its troops from Namibia and grant it full independence. But South Africa refused to withdraw, and SWAPO in turn decided to intensify its armed struggle from its military bases in neighboring Angola. The apartheid regime felt besieged, but they were reluctant to conduct another full-scale invasion of Angola. The alternative was obvious. Jonas Savimbi and his UNITA rebel army, which South Africans had continued to arm, needed the proper means to eliminate the border threat and ultimately rid them of the incumbent Marxist regime in Angola.
We had to sell the Savimbi. Savimbi was fighting a war, and he was fighting the Soviet Union, plus the Cubans. And we had to sell him as a product.
He had to go to the White House. He had to meet the President of the United States. Then that would have elevated him amongst his own people, and we needed him to be in that position.
We used the Christian religion to extent to portray Savimbi and what he was doing here in Angola to salvage all the damage done by the MPLA towards the church. Now, we made videos of Dr. Savimbi and we showed it in America. And that video changed the attitude towards Savimbi. And because of that, we got him through.
Jonas Savimbi was, like much of Africa, willfully misunderstood by American politicians. If you know nothing about a place, you feel free to paint it with your own fantasies. And for many Americans, Africa was the land of Tarzan or Shaka Zulu or some other romantic, preposterous figure, and Jonas Savimbi fit in that category. For the right wing, he was a sort of Robin Hood. For the left wing, he was a diabolical monster.
He was a very charismatic personality with a good speaking voice, with a tremendous amount of self-confidence. He was a kind of physical leader. Some people would say warlord. But he could also sit across the table and engage in an extremely impressive, erudite conversation in 6 different languages. This was a very accomplished personality, and his very facility with cross-cultural communication made him effective internationally.
With the MPLA. He was able to go to visit the evangelical people in Texas and Mississippi and Louisiana and get their support. And this was very strong Republican territory. So they started saying, well, here's the true anti-communist, the man who can beat the Soviets in Angola. And Reagan got caught up in all of this and treated him like a hero.
Savimbi got the international recognition he sought and became Reagan's new best friend. UNITA became the most sophisticated liberation movement to date, but Savimbi wanted more.
Reagan said, my friend, what can I do for you today? And Savimbi said, President, I did not come here to ask for money. I did not come here to ask for military uniforms or boots or even medicines. Then Reagan said, but what do you want, my friend? To say what you want. You don't want money or nothing. What on earth can I give you to help you? And Savimbi said, Mr. President, this time I came here to ask you for the stingers. When he said stingers, Casey stood up and said, Mr. President, this is a restricted weapon. Even our friends in Saudi Arabia do not have it. Then Reagan said for a few seconds like this, and looked at Casey and said, the man wants stingers, give him stingers. Like that. The man wants stingers, give him the stingers.
We weren't that enthusiastic about the stingers. But basically, he made a very good military argument. He said that if I can neutralize the Angolan Air Force, and if I can neutralize their tanks, that's all I need in order to complete my ability to stalemate the war. That was their objective. It was not defeat of the MPLA, it was negotiations.
While the CIA was busy strengthening Savimbi's military power, Chester Crocker's team at the State Department were struggling to sell their peace process that aimed to get Cuban troops out of Angola in return for South African departure from Namibia.
Os americanos diziam, não senhor, vocês têm que retirar as tropas cubanas de Angola. E nós dizíamos, as tropas cubanas vieram a Angola para defender Angola dos sul-africanos, não é da UNITA, é dos sul-africanos que estão um perigo aí na fronteira. E então, a única forma de que as tropas sul-africanas não sejam um perigo para a nossa fronteira é que os sul-africanos também se retirem da Namíbia. E aí, a parte cubana estava de acordo. Eles diziam, bom, se a nossa retirada leva a que haja um país africano que se torne independente, disse, de acordo.
Do the South Africans go first or the South Africans wait for the Cubans? You can imagine the kind of discussions we had with this interesting cast of characters the South Africans said, we may consider implementing Resolution 435 once all the Cubans have gone home. Thank you very much, we said to Foreign Minister Bigboda, but that won't sell. And by the same token, the Angolans said, of course, once the South Africans have gone home, there's no problem. We don't need Cubans. It's not an issue. So why do you have to negotiate it? It stands to reason. It will just happen. So we'd say to the Angolans, try selling that in Pretoria.
6 years of shuttle diplomacy and very little had been achieved. Time was running out, and Reagan's second term as president was coming to an end. The warring parties wanted to negotiate, but each needed to fortify its position before sitting at the negotiating table. The MPLA forces asked the Soviets for help to crush Savimbi's stronghold once and for all.
You had the Soviet doctrine coming through, hard and clear. You don't stop, you attack, you attack, you attack. You do the same thing, you go to hiding every day, but you couldn't care less, you come. You come. That's what happened. I mean, first of all, they threw in 21st Battalion. It got a hiding. Then they threw in 59 Battalion. It got a hiding. Then they threw in 47 Battalion. It got a hiding. Then they withdrew.
Durante varios años, el pensamiento militar nuestro y el pensamiento militar soviético en Angola no se pusieron de acuerdo. Porque los asesores soviéticos, gente brillante desde el punto de vista de la guerra, para hacer la guerra mundial, para tomar Berlín, sin embargo no entendían bien lo que había que hacer en Angola. Pero bueno, los soviéticos eran los que asesoraban a la FAPLA, era soviética, no era cubana. Por lo tanto, ellos decidían. Nosotros podíamos dar nuestra opinión, no estamos de acuerdo, pero bueno, si quieren hacerlo, pueden hacerlo. Nosotros no somos dueños ni de Angola, ni de la FAPLA, ni de la Unión Soviética. No participamos.
The Angolan troops and their Soviet advisors were routed at the Lomba River. The Soviets left behind a litter of burnt-out vehicles and discarded equipment. Over 2,000 Angolans died in this battle alone. To make matters worse, part of the army was encircled. The Cubans could not stand by and watch their allies being crushed.
They felt, I guess, that they had to listen to the Soviets when it came to military advice until the Lomba River fiasco and the initiative of Fidel Castro coming forward and saying, Soviets don't know how to fight in African wars. We do.
El 15 de noviembre, reunión del Estado Mayor y la dirección, presidida por Fidel, se tomó la decisión de resolver el problema de una vez y para siempre. Expulsar a los surafricanos de Angola. Para expulsar a los surafricanos de Angola no eran con 10 hombres ni con los 20.000 que teníamos. Se requerían grandes fuerzas antiaéreas, aéreas, blindados y artillería. Sacando de nuestra propia fuerza, sacándolas de Cuba. Toda la mejor artillería antiaérea que tenemos en Cuba se envió para allá. Cuando teníamos aquí las amenazas de agresión contra Cuba, el gobierno Reagan, todo eso. Pero bueno, había que resolver aquella situación.
As in 1975, the decision to send additional Cuban troops was not discussed with Moscow. In November of 1987, the Russian-Cuban relations were more tense than ever. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev to power had visibly changed Soviet priorities regarding the Third World.
Здесь было принято решение не совместное перебрасывать войска. В то же самое время у меня было такое впечатление, что Кастро с некоторым беспокойством взирает на положение в Советском Союзе. А уж с 1988 года дела пошли таким образом, что было не до Африки уже. Горбачев, когда пришел к власти, потому что в центре политики были отношения с Соединенными Штатами, перестал интересоваться африканскими делами по-настоящему. То есть мы убежали из третьего мира. Мы, так сказать, выражаясь старым языком, сдали все позиции американцам.
It became more and more apparent to us that there were serious problems between the Cubans and the Russians. They feared Gorbachev and Reagan's coming to agreement The Russians, for their part, began to, because they couldn't afford it, cut back on the level of subsidy to Cuba, thus giving the Cubans even less reason to be beholden to them. And Angola, in this context, became even more important to the Cubans, even as the Russians came to see it as an embarrassment and an obstacle to better relations with the United States.
It was that point that the Cubans made the decision to basically double the forces they had in Angola. Basically, if you wanted to find out how many Cubans there are, you start counting baseball diamonds from satellites, and we could look down.
Cuban Army regulations required a baseball field for every certain number of troops. So when they built a baseball field, a new one, you knew there was an addition of troops. When they closed a baseball field, you knew some had left.
Massive Cuban reinforcements were flown in to rescue the trapped MPLA forces. The final confrontation between the Cuban, Angolan, and South African armies took place around the tiny village of Cuitucuanaval.
Now, if you see this type of air traffic, you've got to think. You've got to say, what the hell is going on? They started hating us. We knew where the operation headquarters were. We knew where the anti-aircraft and the artillery, and we opened fire.
Achava-se que se ganhasse em Cuitucuanaval, depois estava aberta a via para avançarem para o norte de Angola. E era um ponto importante de defesa estratégica, mas é uma vila. As pessoas falam da cidade do Cuitucuanaval, aquilo é uma pequena vila. Tanto que nós, às vezes, trazíamos tropas, né? Tropas do centro ou do norte, vão para Cuitucuanaval. Então, eles desembarcavam na pista. Então, quando a gente batia num quartel, né? Eu lembro que uma vez um veio perguntar, disse, chefe, mas quando é que vamos à cidade do Cuito? Disse, estás na cidade do Cuito? Disse, é isto que eu venho defender. Dizia.
The whole effort was conducted by Fidel Castro, by telephone from Havana. He was a commanding officer. How you can do a thing like that, I wouldn't know. I mean, it's impossible. It gave us a problem from our side because we didn't know him. We didn't know his way of thinking, what type of personality he was. Because that's the thing, you've got to know in war. You've got to know the chap on the other side as well as you know yourself. You must know his strong points and his weaker points. That's how you're successful, otherwise you're not.
The battle raged on, costing an estimated 25,000 lives. All sides claimed victory without managing to stop the war. The combat at Cuitucuanaval lasted 6 months and became Africa's largest battle since World War II.
La historia de África va a tener un momento muy importante. Va a ser antes de Cuitucuanaval y otra después de Cuitucuanaval. La poderosa Surá, los blancos, la raza superior, se estrellaron contra un pedazo de territorio defendido por negros y mestizos. Pero no estamos buscando ese objetivo. Sino una institución razonable. Puede ser que pierdan no solo Namibia, puede ser que pierdan el apartheid. Queremos que este problema se resuelva ahora y creo que estaremos en la antesala de la solución del problema del apartheid.
Stalemate on the battlefield was exactly what Chester Crocker needed to revive the peace talks. The only way out was a negotiated solution between governments, and that, by definition, excluded Jonas Savimbi. But before Crocker knew it, the Cubans came up with a surprise.
Well, I was in the National Security Council, and I got a call from Peggy Delaney, the daughter of Rockefeller, and she said, I'm here in Cuba on some sort of a meeting of NGOs, and Castro called me in and gave me a message.
The basic message was this diplomacy is missing a critical ingredient. Yes, that critical ingredient is direct physical Cuban participation. If there were to be Cuban participation, this diplomacy would be more realistic and it would have better prospects for success. And the Americans' continued refusal to talk directly to the Cubans and to include them in the negotiating process was an obstacle. It would be difficult to imagine a more direct hint.
So this led to a major dilemma. Do you sit at the same table as the Cubans? Now, Chester Crocker, of course, wanted to, but he knew that sitting at the same table as the Cubans was politically very dangerous inside the United States. So he went to see George Shultz, who very courageously said, I authorize you to meet with the Cubans, but you must talk only about Angola and Namibia. If they bring up the U.S. trade embargo or anything like that, refuse to talk about it.
The meeting took place at the presidential palace in Luanda. The Cubans had finally earned their place at center stage.
We knew they were next door because we'd been briefed. And at a certain moment we said, okay, let's try. Let's see if we can make this work. Invite your Cuban friends to join this process so they don't have to sit in the next room with earphones. They can actually be here at the table. So in came the Cubans, and they were just as pleased and as proud as you could imagine. There were smiles from ear to ear. They were delighted.
Que estava sempre com cigarro na boca. Sabe, os americanos, lá nos Estados Unidos, por exemplo, nas salas de reuniões, na sala onde tem ar-condicionado, mesmo no restaurante, não se pode fumar. Né? E por isso foi uma surpresa, na reunião estar aí o resqueio a poluir a sala toda com fumo do tabaco, que tem um cheiro.
Yo, muy satisfecho, con toda intención, fui con mi tabaco para darle un toque cubano a las negociaciones. Los cubanos fumamos tabaco y somos los productores de los mejores tabacos del mundo.
The air became heavy for some of the non-smokers in the room. Risquet, a very jolly fellow with very sort of rotund presence, very outspoken, and most of his interventions took minimum 20 minutes.
Primero hay una primera discusión sobre el cese del apoyo de Estados Unidos a la UNITA, y creo que le dice a los angolanos, bueno, pero el cese del apoyo de Estados Unidos a la UNITA es un problema entre angolanos y norteamericanos, no es de cubanos. Cuando vino el punto de la retirada cubana, en que estábamos dispuestos a estar hasta que se liquidara la PAJEI, pero los angolanos no estaban de acuerdo en llevar la cosa tan lejos. Y la solución que habíamos acordado, solución global con retirada total.
At last, the South Africans, Angolans, Cubans, and Americans sat to discuss concrete steps to end the war. But the fighting at Cuito Cuanaval continued, and every minor victory or loss altered the givens at the negotiating table. The next meeting, held in Cairo, would make or break the peace process.
When ministers get around a big table in a major capital like Cairo, they really can't help themselves. They just can't resist microphones. And they just go from bad to worse. And Risquet managed to say things about Cuba's heroic contributions to African stability and development, and Cuba's intention to see to it that peace would come when there was an end of apartheid and when there was an end of this and an end of colonial rule in Namibia.
It was a meeting almost of emotional hatred. Mr. Risquet, he started by launching a vicious attack on us. Vicious. Saying you've always been imperialists, racists, capitalists, causing trouble wherever you went, etc., etc.
At that point, Puk Botha and Magnus Milan just went after the Cubans, and it was very dramatic. And it was basically a test of manhood. A lot of testosterone in the atmosphere, I think is the way to put it.
Entretanto, começaram a haver declarações do Pico-Bota, dizendo que Angola ia nacionalizar as tropas cubanas como angolanos para ficarem lá, ia casar cubanos com angolanas, né, para eles serem angolanos, uma série de manobras. Não, sempre está bem.
Porque decían que íbamos a dejar ahí cubanos como casados, como matrimonio, para dejar tropas camufladas. Un absurdo. Desde luego le contestamos con mucha fuerza. Le dijimos que no podíamos decir el número de matrimonio porque en Cuba el matrimonio es una cosa libre entre personas de dos sexos. Y ahí que en Cuba ni en Angola había la Moral Act que había en Sudáfrica, donde se prohibían los matrimonios birraciales.
Nós também queríamos fazer pedido. Queremos saber quantos negros estão em prisão, que estão nas prisões do apartheid da África do Sul. Pico-Bota. Se eu fosse jovem, jogávamos aqui a soco, íamos jogar pancada, porque eu não admito uma coisa disso. Não. Ah, e tá bom, intervalo. Calmar as coisas.
Dame un tabaco ahí. Vengo a buscar un tabaco, señor de la prensa.
Only for a cigar.
I'm not making any statement, I'm just looking for a cigar. Right?
It seemed the talks were headed for total breakdown. But later that night, an unexpected turn of events opened a new window of opportunity.
We went for a drink in this pub in the Cairo Hotel. There were some Cubans, including Mr. Esquet. Then we had a drink together, and I said to him, has it ever occurred to you that we could both be winners? And he chuckled in his drink, and he said, what do you mean? I said to him, look, to put it in simple terms, if we carry on with this war, we will both be losers. If you withdraw your troops on the basis of having given Namibia its independence, your leader, Fidel Castro, can claim that he won. You claim a victory of a greater nature, namely the freedom of the people of Namibia you have achieved. And I say to the white voters of South Africa, I got rid of the Cuban troops in Angola. And our war is also ended. That makes us both winners. And suddenly I could see a total dramatic change in his whole attitude.
After the Cairo meeting, a ceasefire at Quito Carnival was implemented. But it wasn't easy to clinch the final deal. Having South Africa show its goodwill by at least releasing the legendary prisoner Nelson Mandela became a sticking point.
The whole world was descending on us. Apartheid was viewed as a prime evil. The release of Mr. Mandela was demanded. I knew that we had to reduce the tension to be able to release Mr. Mandela and the other political prisoners. If we could not do so, and the only way to relieve the tension in southern Africa was to come to an agreement and end the war in Angola.
By forcing the South Africans to trade the independence of Namibia for the Cuban withdrawal, that in the end justified everything to Castro, that he could think of himself as having been the father of Namibian independence and the man who ended colonialism in Africa. Cuba, in fact, demonstrated a level of responsibility in its behavior and maturity in its judgment that arguably should have been recognized by the United States as an important gesture deserving some response. But the politics of this in the United States, that is the politics of relations with Cuba, are poisonous in the extreme. So in the end, Cuba, which acted responsibly and should have been acknowledged for doing so, got no such acknowledgement.
On December 22, 1988, almost 1 month to the day before the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency, peace accords were signed in New York. The parties simultaneously signed documents granting Namibia's independence and ensuring the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola. The withdrawal of 450,000 Cubans was scheduled to take place over 30 months, ending 13 years of Cuban military presence in Angola. A month short of the deadline, the last Cuban soldier left the African soil. With him ended the epic of Cuba's military support for African revolutions.
Y como habíamos dicho, de Angola solo nos llevaremos los restos de nuestros hermanos caídos. No nos traemos ni petróleo, ni diamantes, ni nada, sino los restos de los compañeros que murieron. Y aquel 7 de diciembre, al mismo tiempo, en todos los cementerios del país, al mismo tiempo, a una misma hora, recibieron sepultura a todos los combatientes caídos en África.
The total number of Cuban casualties remains one of the island's best-kept secrets. But military historians agree that at least 10,000 Cubans died in Angola.
En ese periodo que retiramos las tropas de Angola, vinieron también un batallón que teníamos en el Punta Negra, en la República de Congo-Brazzaville, y las tropas que teníamos en Etiopía. En ese periodo regresaron todas las tropas a casa. Y desde el día en que el Che cruzó aquel lago, Tangañica, y llegó a Zaire, que fue el 24 de abril de 1965, hasta ese 25 de mayo de 1991, transcurrieron lo que llamamos la gran epopeya de Cuba en África. Transcurrieron un cuarto de siglo, un año, un mes, un día.
The battle to liberate Africa from colonialism had been won, but the war conducted in the name of real independence is still being fought. Revolutionaries like Che Guevara, Patrice Lumumba, Amilcar Cabral and Agostinho Neto